Good. All right, so welcome everybody to the June 6th installment of the Denver Erlang Elixir Meetup. As the lady told you, we're going to record this, and if I remember, I will upload it to YouTube for posterity because it's going to be amazing. That's what I've heard anyway. Okay, so tonight we'll do some announcements. We'll have speakers. We'll have optional show and tell, and then we'll hang out on Zoom as long as you guys would like to. Show and tell, most of you guys have been here before, but basically if you got something you want to share with the group, code project, something cool you learned, question, problem, whatever, kind of like lightning talks. So we'll open the floor, and if you want to share something, that would be awesome. These are your lovely organizers. I believe I am the organizer tonight. So hey, we've got Jeff, Jeffrey, Dylan, Alexandra, and Brett presenting or helping you to make this thing happen. You can get a hold of us at meetup.com or in the Denver channel of the Elixir Lang Slack channel. I forget what that's called. Anyway, that's basically to redirect you over to our little private Slack, which is Denver Beam, which is a great way to get a hold of organizers or chat about all things local or related to the meetup. A brief thank you to our sponsors, Pay It Off and Blinker. Pay It Off does the Zoom and Meetup, and Blinker provided some meetup space last month, which was lovely, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Does anyone have any general announcements? No, just muffling microphones. All right, I'm going to put in a plug for ElixirConf because, hey, it's going to be in Denver again this year. So if you're in Denver, you should go. If you're like, hey, I'd like to hang out with Brett and go to Denver, you should go. So it's over Labor Day weekend. They don't have tickets on sale yet, but they are looking for speakers. So hopefully it'll be fun. It was good a couple of years ago. It was, yeah. So anyway, come out. It would be good. In-person updates. So last month we did get together at Blinker in person, a few of us. We did a hybrid. It worked okay. Not a lot of people showed up. I think we got to kind of iron out the kinks. I will be away next month, so we'll have a special guest host. But when we come back in August, I'm going to see, I think Solomon was on the call, but I'm thinking of trying to do a barbecue if the barbecue is actually working at Blinker, so kind of have a summer get together thing themed. So watch this space. I do want to do more. I'd like to get local people together if we can, but we'll still do the hybrid thing as long as it makes sense. All right, every month I ask the two, anyway, ask a couple questions about hiring. So is there anybody looking for an Elixir Erlang person? All right. On the other hand, anybody looking for an Elixir Erlang job? All right, Lay, good. I can refer you to resources, but actually a couple of the jobs I think that were mentioned previously are still probably available if you look in the jobs channel, but awesome. Okay, my monthly plea for speakers. So yes, we have nobody booked beyond tonight. So would love to have someone step up, like Rowland is stepping up again, amazingly, which is awesome. And it doesn't have to be a super huge presentation, can be very short intro talk, but if you want to do something a little more hardcore, or you know someone who's just burning to practice his or her ElixirConf talk, say, let me know, because we would love to get them here to practice, as we love speakers, which is good. All right, so Rowland is going to be talking. I wasn't exactly sure. Jeff gave me several topics that you were going to be talking about. So I'm calling it Erlang myths. It's something Erlang-y, which is kind of cool because we usually do Elixir. And ironically, I am also going to be doing some mostly Erlang-y stuff with just a little Elixir, talking about the latest OTP update. So with that, I am going to stop sharing Oh, did I stop recording? No. Oh, that's it. I stopped sharing, but I didn't turn off the screen. Okay. So Roland, if you would be so kind as to introduce yourself and take the floor, please.
Sure. So I'm Roland. I have a knack for getting myself into kind of the dark corners of the beam. And this is no exception. At least I don't think it's an exception. We'll find out. So in this case, I was talking with a colleague about enum.map. And I mentioned offhandedly that I knew that when you passed a list to enum.map, it calls out to lists.map. And I knew that because of my open talk exploring that. And so we got to looking at lists.map's implementation. And my colleague remarked that this function call doesn't look tail call optimized. So it's calling a function, it's consing that to the recursive call of the function, but it has this, the square brackets on the outside for the list constructor. So it looks like if it's following an ordinary call stack and it's not optimized, that it would go all the way down calling all the recursive functions and then come all the way back up assembling those lists. So I figured that this is list.map, one of the most used functions in Elixir. It probably is optimized. But I wanted to understand more about what's going on. So to that end, I wrote a kind of naively tail call optimized version of map. I'm using Elixir here, but it turns out that it doesn't matter, and you'll see why in a moment. Doesn't matter that I'm not using Erlang. But in this case, I use the same function then list structure that Erlang is using. They have a kind of a reverse syntax to what Elixir's used to. There's no pipe operator. But in this case, I'm calling the function on the head, instantiating that in a list, and then concatenating that to the recursive call on the tail. So in this case, this is the last part of the function. It's part of the tail, so we can go all the way down and do it once and not that. Now, there's some considerations, like one question is, isn't plus plus slow? And some other things that may have come up as you're thinking about and dealing with Elixir and Erlang. But the first thing I did is I benchmarked these two functions, and it turned out that they were roughly the same. But I didn't want to leave it with that because benchmarks can be kind of notoriously iffy depending on the input values, the specific conditions of the benchmark, and other things. And I didn't have kind of a wide enough set of cases that I wanted to put it through. And so, inspired by one of the earlier talks that came from Denver, Elixir, I thought about trying to disassemble both functions and seeing what happens in the assembly, the beam assembly of each of these. And I found, after some investigation, that there is a beam disasm module that's just baked into OTP. It turns out this is from a pre-just-in-time compiler arrangement of the beam. It's scheduled to be taken out at some point. If you're interested in the module, it's currently in OTP. I don't know if it's in OTP 25. I doubt Brett has an update on that. But I believe there's a hex module that just extracts this one module and pulls it out if you're interested in investigating it in a non-time sensitive way. But this module has a function.file that will take a binary string of beam code and disassemble it. And so what I did is I used code.which on, say, lists. And this finds the beam file on my system. So this is the exact folder that beam file resides in. And then I can pass that to file.read. And that gives me just a binary full of beam code. And I can pass that to this beam disassemble file function. And it gives me back a record that contains information about the assembly code in this module. So it's a beam file. This is the module lists. This is the list of all the exports from that module. some information about the compilation. But most important to us is this list down here. It's a list of tuples that contain functions, so key member, key search, reverse, append, subtract, etc.
So are these all like Beam primitives for the
Yes.
VM?
So this is like a tupleized version of the assembly code.
That's cool.
So I believe in an earlier talk, there's like a VS Code extension that like did the disassembly for you. This is like the Elixir Erlang friendly version of the same thing. So like get list on X at position 0, position X, position 1, X, position 2, test if that list is empty using this function, so on and so forth. So it's creating references and then calling back to those references. And so I put together a function.
Which file are you, I mean, you did a disassemble, but which file are you disassembling?
So in this case, I'm disassembling the Beam file for the lists, the Erlang lists module.
Oh, okay.
But importantly, this is just like a wall of code. I only care about the map function insofar as this talk is concerned. And so I wrote a find asm function that takes the fifth element, that's not intentional, and finds the function based on a function name. So if I give it a module and a function in atom form, then it'll extract just the assembly code for that particular function. So I can do find asm, lists, and map, and get the assembly code for lists and map. So this is assembly code. We can walk through it step by step, but I don't want to put the entire audience to sleep. And like importantly, this is optimized by the compiler. So it's not anything that we should really be concerning ourselves too much with. But where it gets interesting is if we run this on TCO, on my TCO map, try to do that. It's hidden underneath my Zoom controls. But we get this assembly, and I'll spare you like scrolling up and then scrolling down and then scrolling up and then scrolling down to try and compare these two. I already did that in a diff. So I saved both of them to a text file and did a diff on them. And what we find is that these functions are largely the same. So we have some line numbers and some label numbers, the name of the function, and some more label numbers. And this test is calling back to a specific label number. And when we get the same thing, a line number, a label number, a function, but this time it's TCO map, a different label number, and then a different reference back to a label. But the kind of guts of the function are the same: allocate, move, call fun, swap, move. This call is different, but it's using the name, so that's why it's different. And similarly, we get a label, test with a reference to a label, test with a reference to a label, so on and so forth. So what this tells us is that absent some line numbers and the function names, these two functions compile to exactly the same assembly code. So it's settled then. List.map is tail call optimized, or is it? I knew that they were the same, and I figured that they were optimized, but I still don't know whether or not they're tail call optimized. And so with some investigation, I found this article on the Erlang documentation called 7 Myths of Erlang Performance. And myth 2, coming back to that plus operator, actually answers our question all the way down in this kind of footnote at the bottom. Or this is slightly more efficient to do because here you do not build a list element only to copy it directly. Or it would be more efficient if the compiler did not automatically write plus accumulator to heads, cons, tail. So that tail call optimized function that I wrote, attempting to be tail call optimized, was automatically rewritten by the compiler to look exactly like the Erlang implementation of the function. Now, myth 1 is that tail recursive functions are much faster than recursive functions. And hilariously, this calls out to a Fred Hebert article where he goes into extreme depth on benchmarking a bunch of different tail call versus body recursion functions to try and tease out some information. But the key point is his conclusion, which is one thing that's to remember, no matter what, is that writing clean code generally leads to better performances. This is something that many languages cannot claim is true, but Erlang certainly can. In the general case, the optimizations in the Erlang VM come from observing idiomatic code in production, and a clean one at that. This is why body recursion might be better and why many other optimizations were made. Clean code is the best code. But this is kind of taken in context of the rest of his article, and I'll link both of these after my talk, that if you have a performance concern in your program, don't trust the compiler to do that work for you. Benchmark it yourself for your specific use case and understand where the bottleneck is. And that's really what it gets to, is that in certain circumstances, the tail call recursion is faster. In other circumstances, the body recall recursion is faster. In general, the body recursion is faster in the cases that he tested, but he was able to use benchmarks to figure out what was going on there. Measure, 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 as he says. So I invite all of you to explore the functions that you're using, and if you feel courageous enough, dive into the assembly code. You might just learn something.
Always sound advice. All right, any questions for our intrepid code explorer?
Which version of Erlang are you on? Is it 24?
I think so, yeah. I don't think I've upgraded to 25 yet. Let's look. 24.
I thought it was
yes.
24.3.3, yeah. Yes, and you're right. I have not tested that on OTP 25. So yeah, we'll
one thing I didn't show in the talk is that if you call up the documentation for that, it literally doesn't have any compiled documentation. I have Erlang documentation compiled on my system. It doesn't show up for that module. Like, you're not supposed to use it.
right. Yeah, I could see it's yeah, it's like a yeah, convenience utility function.
Yeah, the disassembler is still there in Erlang 25. I've been using, so.
Well, there you go.
Great. All right. As you were, carry on. Enjoy Beam assembly. Cool. All right. Well, thank you for that, Rowland. Appreciate it. If you have other questions, you can, if you're sticking around, you can perhaps grab him later in Zoom. All right. So I got to switch my presentation to the actual content. Which I will apologize in advance because it is not a polished talk, but rather a mad scrambling to try to put together some meaningful content last minute because we didn't have another speaker. So I said, hey, let's talk some OTP because we just are in the process of soon migrating to OTP 25 at work. And I was going to say, what is new? So I thought I would share that with you. So I have to do this song and dance again. All right, so screen share, desktop 2. Boom. Okay, so mostly I'll be talking about OTP 25, but I'll also be talking about the upcoming Elixir release briefly. It's a little less dramatic, but there's still a few things. So anyway, most people on this call probably know what's going on, but I thought I'd put together a brief introduction to OTP for people who might not have a clue. So OTP stands for Open Telecom Platform, which is pretty much synonymous with Erlang. It's the underlying ecosystem for Elixir, Gleam, Lisp-flavored Erlang, and other Beam languages. It's developed by Ericsson a long time ago. I didn't realize it was that long ago. It's almost 40 years ago, which is shocking, at least 35. So that's a pretty good, lots of development there. Open sourced also like 25 years ago. So that's, it's been around, which is great. In the Elixir community, when we say OTP, we're often talking about the distribution libraries. So we do talk about Erlang, but in particular, hey, I use Phoenix and I also use OTP. Well, in that sense, people are referring to things like GenServer, gen event, things like this under the covers, collectively known as OTP. All right, so OTP has been in development, like I said, for like 30-something years, and used to have very intermittent releases. And I think this came out with some of the grand unification of the Beam languages to try to get things a little more organized. There's definitely been more cross-pollination between Erlang and Elixir, certainly over the past 10 years since Elixir's been around. And there's now a very regular cadence, and has been for at least 5 years, I'd say, maybe even longer, where there's a main release. Yes, there's a full release every year and 3 scheduled patch releases. So in the summer, I guess now, because OTP 25 just came out, is 25.0. And then over the next year, we'll get 25.1, 2, and 3. And then next summer, we'll get OTP 26. So there's very regular cadence to these releases now. It does follow semantic versioning, so they don't do anything breaking outside of a main version number. Although that said, they have been a lot more aggressive about deprecating features. I think there's a rule they keep it around for 2 releases, but I wouldn't swear by that. They do keep obsoleted features around for a couple releases, but I don't know exactly how long. But then they do deprecate them, which is kind of nice, because then you're sort of forced to roll forward. And yes, the Elixir releases often follow OTP. So now that like OTP 25 is out, 1.14 is going to drop very soon, because it needs, now the new features of OTP 25 can be taken advantage of in Elixir 1.14. All right, so the bulk of my talk is actually based on this lovely blog post by Kenneth Lundeen, who's one of the core team developers at Ericsson. I've seen him speak at various Erlang conferences in particular. It's a nice little digest of, hey, what's new and exciting. So I picked, I don't know, maybe 75% of these that I'll talk about today, just to kind of get you a flavor for what's new and what's coming and why. One of the biggest efforts, I'd say, over the past few years with Erlang is, again, the kind of marriage between Erlang and Elixir. So one of the great things that Elixir brought to the Beam ecosystem was tooling, right? So they kind of added better big build tools, Hex, lots of other features. And I think one of the motivations that Jose had for making Elixir in the first place was to kind of standardize and extend missing libraries and things. Well, interestingly, now it's going back, and Erlang is adopting some of the functionality that were added by Elixir, right? The nice thing about that, though, is that then there can be, everybody in Beam can use them. It's not just Elixir. Also, you can call Elixir code from Erlang, particularly nasty. Very easy to call Erlang from Elixir, but not the other way around. So anyway, the first couple of slides, I want to talk about some new functions that are for Elixirists absolutely nothing new. There's this new maps function called groups from list, which, hey, looks an awful lot like the Elixir enums group by function. Same functionality, same idea, different syntax, but essentially does the same sort of thing. So even though maps have been around for quite a while, actually, they were introduced, I could do math, can't I? Yes, 8 releases ago. They don't have the same functionality that Elixir does, so they're adding to that. Same deal with lists. So weirdly, there's a couple new list functions, like this enumerate function that is exactly on parity with the enum with index function that we have in Elixir. Yeah, there's just an example of how to use it. Nothing new. We already had list sorting, but there wasn't a way to unique them, shockingly, right? I mean, some of these, I guess you would implement your own, but now there's a built-in. So getting yeah, exactly, like the enum unique function. So getting kind of functional parity on both sides. And it would be interesting in the future to see if the Elixir code then is going to be wrapping Erlang. Who knows? Let's see here, other random things. So I've had this problem actually at work before where people hate scientific notation, and they've added a function in, or an option to a function, I guess I should say, in Erlang so that it will create the shortest correctly rounded string representation of a float that you can convert from that string back to a float. Now, floating point numbers in computers are notoriously imprecise, so that is a bit of a trick. This is the example here they give you. So this float to list function, if you give the short argument and you convert it back to a float, so float to list to float, it's exactly the same value. So that's kind of cool, and it's valid for quite a wide range, which is kind of surprising, potentially useful. And yes, you have to go back to scientific notation for that. The cool thing is that it uses a great new algorithm, which is 3 times faster. This is actually kind of interesting because if you're parsing like JSON or something and you're doing a lot of string to float conversions, that can actually take a minute, right, to do some of that conversion. So if they're doing a faster algorithm, that will help overall system performance without changing any code. So that's kind of cool. I didn't realize this, but there are selectable features in Erlang, which I think are basically like beta. It's new things that they're adding that might be not backwards compatible. So what you do is you say, hey, Erl, enable this feature, like in this case, the maybe expression. Or you give it the dash, enable all the features, and it's kind of like turning the beta flag on. So if you want to try out the new feature, you can enable that, see if you're still compatible, and then if not, fix it so it does work. So this one I thought was kind of interesting. I was looking at this code saying, wow, this looks really familiar. Where have I seen this before? And then I'm like, oh, that's basically a with statement. It's a with statement from Elixir that is now going to be doing the same damn thing in Erlang. Because if you've ever written Erlang, and I haven't written it in a long time, but I do remember you can nest the crap out of things because you always have to check all of the return values, and it gets really, really gnarly. It's one of the things I actually like about the with statement in Elixir is it's a lot more compact and readable. But here you go. Now the maybe feature works exactly the same way. You have a bunch of functions, and if any of the patterns fail, it goes into the else clause and does pattern matching to wrap up. So that's pretty cool. Probably the feature that I was most excited about in this whole release was some of the just-in-time compiler improvements that have been done. So last year, they first introduced this, which was, I don't remember what it was. I'll make up a number, 25%, 30%, I don't know. It was a non-trivial performance improvement, zero code change, right? You just simply recompile it with the new OTP and it's better. And that continues. So the deal with JIT is it produces native code, basically it just pre-compiles it instead of interpreting the strings like a Python or Ruby or something like that. So that's pretty cool. Again, the big win, better improved performance. This is the one that got me excited though, because I've got a new Mac, and the ARM platform is now also supported in their just-in-time compiler, but also evidently the newer Raspberry Pis have that. So I'm thinking for nerves, could be nice, little optimization there. And again, don't have to do anything, just link to the new OTP and you get the advantages. There's a whole article, interestingly, if you go to the blog post that I showed earlier, and yeah, they said it could do nothing, or you can get up to a 4-time improvement. I'm like, okay, I'll take that. So in certain cases, it can be a huge speed up. Not always, but it can be. So yay. And again, the magic, no code changes required. All right. So also another cool improvement is some built-in function error messages were improved. Erlang is notorious, a bit like Dialyzer too, for having really cryptic error messages, super crap. Like you really have no idea what is wrong here. This is an effort. I don't know exactly where it came from because it's actually touted in the new Elixir release as, hey, look, great new feature. But the error messages are greatly improved. So, oh, right. Yep, here we go. So they advertise this as a new feature in Elixir 1.14 because it can take advantage of these changes in OTP 25. But here's an example of the code. So in the first case, the first line, we've got a function call with 4 arguments, and the exception is there is a bad argument. Okay, you don't know what's wrong, you don't know which one. Now it says, hey, look, you've got one that's supposed to be a float, and let's see here. Yes, so it should be of type float, expected either a float or an integer, but instead it got a string. So way more readable. You have a clue of what's going on. I've seen this theme a lot, again, over the past few years. There's really been an emphasis on like documentation help, error messages, trying to make the whole beam just a little more user-friendly. Same vein there. This one's a little more very Erlang-y, and that is an error reporting for records. Records are sort of like very fixed structs or maps. So if you're actually calling Erlang directly, you'll work with records, but if you're just doing Elixir, you probably won't. Anyway, again, improved error reporting, which is yay. This one was actually kind of interesting. I actually heard about it on a podcast a couple weeks ago, and I don't fully understand the details, but basically, if you've got an ETS table and you're wanting to keep different nodes in sync, you can coordinate that and have it write concurrently. However, that's not free, right? So say you've only got a couple nodes, you don't necessarily want a bunch of writers going on there with a bunch of locks. If now instead you put it on auto mode, it will say, hey, you've got 2 nodes, whatever, don't worry about it. Now you've got 10 nodes, it will automatically switch over into the write concurrency mode and start locking for you. Yes, right, it's got fine-grained locking that it sets. So it's just kind of a nice optimization. Also, I guess if you were like auto-scaling, say you started out with small project, you're getting nailed with traffic, now you want to take advantage of that for your little distributed environment. You don't have to change your setting or pay the price for a small number of nodes. It only kicks in with lots of concurrency. So nice. This one actually is kind of interesting. I didn't know the Gem server had this format status callback. I mean, I just didn't know that it existed. But basically, it allows you to filter out sensitive information from crash reports, which is actually pretty useful because, again, at work we have issues with personally identifiable information, secrets, things that you don't want to, oh, look, that social security number just squirted out when the node crashed. You don't want to do that. So this function will clean that up for you. And what is so exciting about that? They changed the arity. Oh, maybe it was just the fact that it exists that I was interested in that. Anyway, my suspicion is, although I have not seen that you'll be able to take advantage of that in Elixir as well. All right, moving swiftly onto security. So they're upgrading the version of OpenSSL that they're linking to. They've got the new version. They're still maintaining support for a previous version. Old stuff still works, but they're kind of saying, hey, if you're going to keep upgrading OTP, you're going to need to upgrade things so the old versions will not work anymore. They added the ability to fetch certificates using OS-specific definitions. Didn't realize this, but both Mac and Windows don't use files for their certs. They, I guess, have other repositories or something. But essentially, you can say, hey, go get your cert from the source on your OS, and it will get that for you. So that's kind of helpful especially if you're doing cross-platform stuff. I think this is the last thing that I had there. There's also a new pseudo random number generator, which is quite useful for encryption, generating unique things. They really got what is potentially the fastest possible implementation for random number generating, pseudo-random number generators for Erlang. The existing one took 60 nanoseconds, and now this new one takes 4. So it's like crazy optimized. So if you're doing a lot of like simulation, generating UUIDs or other random values in your system, this is available to you, and it will be way more efficient. All right, so let's say I'm coding in Elixir. Why do I care about all this stuff? Well, you can call any Erlang function from Elixir. Super easy. And there's lots of features that Elixir gets for free because it's built on top of Erlang. So things like the JIT or some of these optimizations that I mentioned, you're going to get it when you upgrade to the latest version. So it's pretty cool. All right, a couple notes here about Elixir 1.14. There's a new type of supervisor, which is kind of interesting, again, that this is coming from the Elixir space, not the Erlang space, but watch this space because I bet it's going to go, you're going to see the backflow there. But there's a different type of supervisor that allows for more dynamic concurrency. And evidently, I didn't realize, but just a good old dynamic supervisor can create bottlenecks. I guess the problem is it's not partitioning the load, right? So you can overload particular nodes and not balance it correctly. So if you fire up a partition supervisor, it gives basically the same number of schedulers. Everybody gets a supervisor. And then here's a little example here. So if you look at the partitioning key, you're using the essentially the IP address, the PID of the process to partition it. So essentially, I think it segments up the load a little more evenly than if you were just doing it yourself. So I have to admit, I didn't fully grok the whole deal, but Jose was excited about it, so I can't argue. The other minor thing that I wanted to mention is a couple of releases ago, we got steps in sequences in our ranges there, and they've just added it to a couple of other new functions, so it's consistent. So you can, for example, step by whatever instead of writing code to calculate what the step is. So syntactic sugar, but it's nice. There are also some big improvements to inspect. There's a whole laundry list. Basically, I went through the release notes on GitHub to try to figure this out, and gleaned a few nuggets. But basically, this has kind of bugged me. And if I read it correctly, it's going to now keep the order of the fields when it dumps in IOInspect, which is great because I oftentimes will dump the fields from like a map, and I'm trying to find where the field is, but the order seems to be sausage. So if they could keep that in the order to find in your file, that would be pretty nice. There's this one was kind of interesting. It sounds like conditional inspection, but it's only for a very few number of data structures like map set and stuff. So I didn't fully understand why that would be so great, but I could have misunderstood what that feature was too. This one I think is an optional keyword called optional that you can when you're defining a structure or you're defining the inspect. So I think what that does is if it's not populated, it won't show it to you when you inspect it. So instead of having a bunch of nils that you don't care about, it will probably skip those. But again, that's my takeaway. And there were like a ton of other changes. So interestingly, this is the current changelog that's out on GitHub, and this is only the first page of it. So there's like a million little things. There aren't a ton of major things, but there's like a lot of niggles. So it will be nice. I mean, there's cool stuff like, multi-line comment support and EAX. There's lots of things in there. And I would encourage you actually to go take a look. Both languages have their own blogs, which is where I found Kenneth Lundine's article. But if you just look in the source, go to GitHub, look at the README, look at the changelog. I mean, that's what I did because I'm not certainly not going to look through every PR, and it's pretty cool. So a bit in the same vein of what Roland was suggesting was look at the code, dig under there, dig under the covers. So hopefully that was somewhat interesting. It's got a few cool new things. We're definitely going to upgrade, take advantage of it, just because it's always new and improved, but not earth-shattering. So, does anybody have any questions? Okay.
Actually, I have a short one on list enumerate. So
Sure.
a list enumerate is backwards from enum into which, or the other version, because the index comes
The list of
first.
the arguments, you mean?
Yeah, because the
Yes.
index comes first, not the other way. But my question is, isn't that basically how arrays are implemented inside Erlang? So could you just use those in arrays at that point?
I don't honestly know. I do know, oh, that representation, like the key value pair
Yeah,
of
the key
elements
value
and
pair,
stuff.
because they never actually implemented array in Erlang. If my memory serves, it was always a
It's
list.
not a, I mean, it is, yes, I don't know the internal details. And if somebody does know, feel free to jump in there. I know it's not like, like a C array. It's not like memory
No.
lined up, but there is some sort of
Yeah.
structure, but I don't know what it is, I'm afraid.
I was just curious because we don't use arrays for good reason. They're slow. They were kind of like before maps. So it's just like a swing at it and they kind of ignored it. I was just curious because there's a bunch of array functions. I would be curious if you could just have your list and then do an array function and then come back out again or something like that.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
know.
You could investigate and tell us next time.
Yeah, I just can't do it right now.
In your free time. All right, anything else? Great. All right. Then why don't we move swiftly on to show and tell? Does anybody have anything that they would like to share with the group or questions they'd like to pose?
I have a show and tell.
Awesome.
Got one too.
Nice. Okay. I'm going to pick Owen because he hasn't spoken yet, and then I'll go to you, Roland, if that's cool. All right. You have the floor, sir.
Sweet. So I've been working on this app, Live Showy. So I did a kind of an initial demo in Big Elixir, and the demo didn't work at first until Q&A. Surprise.
Yeah.
So the part where it works isn't in the video on YouTube, so that's unfortunate. But I'm working on like the next version. So what I built for Big Elixir was just like a local network kind of application where people would connect. And the whole idea is people would connect to the app and be able to play music at the same time from all throughout the auditorium. So I'm trying to take that and build it up for the web. So we'll have this app running, and there's latency to deal with, but theoretically I could play music with my brother in Texas while I'm in Michigan, kind of depending on the music and that kind of thing. But before I can do any of that, I've got to do all this tedious work around authentication and authorization. So I think the talk I submitted to ElixirConf was about authentication using WebAuthn. So this app doesn't have any passwords. It's just going to use either security keys or Touch ID. And then, so that's as secure as could be. What I've been working on over the past week has been role management, or role-based authorization. And so I learned a few things during this process. I already had in mind what I wanted to do, which is I wanted to authorize access to a live view through roles and live permissions. And then I also wanted to authorize individual events within the live view. So I didn't want to maintain a list of all the live views manually in the database. Didn't want to maintain a list of all the events for each of those live views somewhere. That would be messy, and there's no reason to do that. So first I'll kind of show you the live permission schema that I've built here. So this lives within a role. The primary key, it's an embedded schema. For now, there's arguments about whether this should be like just a separate table or something. for now, it works as a embedded schema where each key is just the module. So it's stored in the database as a string, but the application interprets it through a custom type as an atom. So it will parse the string as an existing atom. And whenever it's saving to the database, it will convert it back to a string. And then each live permission has a list or an array of event names. So, and then there's the, all the CRUD operations for managing roles and user roles, which is a kind of a different thing. What I learned though was how to get the event names from all of the live views within the application programmatically. So got a little bit of help through the Elixir Slack on this particular piece, but it was really cool. So this is a new module I created called Code Tracker. Some of this was copied and pasted, but so it's using a couple of compilation hooks. So whenever it's compiling a live view module, it will use these hooks right here. I don't know if I could completely explain it yet, but what it does is it accumulates all this data into a data tracker attribute for the module, which is being registered here. And then whenever the module is being defined, or it's looking for any functions within the module where you're defining a function called handle event. So that sounds familiar. That's a lot of what you're doing in a live view. And then it takes the first argument, which is the event name. So it's usually a string. And if you've defined a handle event with the first argument as a string or a binary, then it's going to put the name of that event into that tracker data attribute just during compilation. And otherwise, if it just ignores all the other functions in that live view module. So before it compiles the module, it will also add this function through a macro. So it adds a function called compiled events, and it takes that tracker data attribute, runs it through unique, just in case there are any kind of duplicate handle events with the same event name, because a lot of times you're pattern matching, and then it sorts it. So the nice thing there is I've added a couple of functions to my application module. So the first thing I do is I have a list modules function that will take the app name. It will look at the application spec and then get all the full list of modules. I've got another function that takes that list and using this wonderful for comprehension that we have in Elixir, it filters that through this function, looking for only modules that define or that that use the live view behavior. So it looks for all of the behaviors in the module, and then if Phoenix Live View is in the behaviors, it will allow that module to be passed through this comprehension, and then it reduces everything into a map. So that map receives the module name as the key, and then that list of compiled events as the value. And then in this live session hook, I will take, if the socket is connected, I will grab the socket view, so the live view from the socket, that's the view module. I'll grab the current user out of the socket assigns. I will take all of the user's roles, and then I will go to the authorization module and find all of the module permissions that are available for this user based on their roles. And then finally, I take the list of allowed events and put that into the socket right here. So what this allows me to do is on any given live view, I haven't implemented like the guarding yet here, or the gating, but for any live view, I can have a user with a role, and if they have that module name in their live permissions, then they'll be able to at least, load or render the live view. And then before they perform any events in the live view, each event will be checked against the list of allowed events so that they can't do anything they're not supposed to do based on their role. So I present that all to say, is this a good idea or a bad idea? I think it's going to do what I want. It's not going to cover all forms of authorization that I will need in the app, but that will give me kind of like the most kind of high level way to allow or disallow certain actions within the application. And if you're thinking about what are the possible roles that would be built up for this app, you would probably have, like, I would be an admin probably, but you might have like initially, let's just say there's going to be one room and there might be, musicians and audience members. So think of two of those roles and different permissions they might have for different actions or events within a live view. So that's what I learned.
I assume that you're only displaying things that people are supposed to be able to do.
Right. Yeah. So this is a big work in progress too. So a lot of this code is super fresh and, working on it here and there. I did build up a live view for managing the roles. So I can also, I meant to mention this. I can also, grab that list of live view modules from the application module. And then for each live view module, since those event names are already compiled, I can render those as options within this form here. So that makes it really easy to, add permissions for a single live view and allow someone, like, not that I would have permissions about logging out, but, maybe only certain users can perform a submit on the settings page or something, What's up, Chris?
So is a few thoughts. First, I think it's slick as hell how you're pulling the events out of the live views. So that's a very neat trick. We've been doing some stuff with kind of our own implementation of like a storybook, like you might run into with Service. So this would, I have some ideas for other places to take this technique. So I think that's really cool. So good work there.
Thank you.
One thing I would caution you, having fought the ACL battle and fought like permissioning more times than I frankly wish. Minor suggestion would be, unless you're very excited about your current approach, you might want to just associate permissions with roles and associate roles with users. Associating permissions directly with users or just stopping at roles is it is a place of sadness and
Right.
it's just a wasteland of tears. So
yeah, to that point, yeah. So these live permissions are listed. So this is where I embed those live permission schemas inside of a role. And then there's also a user role. So I have a many-to-many, one-to-many, I forget what it is. But I have a join table for, users can have one or more roles, and those will be listed in a separate table and preloaded whenever the user is connected to the socket.
Cool. The other thing I'm curious about is, did you look at doing, and I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, I just kind of spaced out. Did you look at using live view hooks at all to kind of help with this, or did you want to keep it just on the on mount and on handle params?
So this is the live view. Well, this is the session hook. So we've got a couple of different types of hooks now. For all of the MIDI, like the music stuff, that's going to use JavaScript hooks for live view. But for kind of like establishing all of the assigns and like loading up all the data and checking things, this is happening within this live session hook. And it's not really guarding anything yet, but
okay, sweet. So you are using it. All right, cool.
I've got a authorization module, and it uses the default session hook right there.
Very cool.
So yeah, you'll start seeing that in different places in the router for like I'll have like collaboration spaces, maybe it's called a room or stage or something, and then people will have roles assigned, and like an audience member can watch a performance, but they wouldn't be able to like connect and start playing notes, for example.
Cool.
I'll wait.
All right.
A couple more seconds.
Any other comments, questions? If
Did you
not,
mention?
then-
Did you mention if this is available online?
Not yet. I think I've got like a placeholder, like a landing page, but the application hasn't been released yet. Source code's, it's in a private repo. I'm really debating what to open source. I think my plan is I'll open source some of the components out of this. So like some of the authentication stuff, I'm playing around with maybe open sourcing, extracting that into a package, and maybe the similar approach with authorization and some of the JavaScript, like some of the live component stuff might also get converted into a package.
Would you feel at all comfortable throwing that that part where you're going code tracker? Could you throw that into a gist or something, or would you want to share that? Because that's like, I really think that's like just a neat gadget.
Yeah, I should give credit where credit is due. So this came from, let me find the thread. I'll post the link to the thread if you want to see. Yeah, I'll find the link while someone else is presenting, and then yeah, because I can't take credit for this piece. Someone who understands the compiler a lot better than I came up with this, and I'll track that down and put that in the chat. Yeah, Lost Cobra Kai. It's on the forums and on Slack. So
very cool.
All right. If there are other questions, let's hand it back over to Rowland.
Me again. Okay, so I've previously introduced everyone to the open helper in IEX, but I find myself over and over and over again just opening IEX to run the open helper. And so my thought was, okay, what if I turn that into a CLI instead? Okay, enum.cap doesn't exist, so let's try a function that does exist. And now I have a CLI called xhelp that implements various functions from the IEX helpers and brings them to the command line. So most notably, I like open, so -o and -- open will open source code. But if you run it without any flags, it will give you documentation. This is great because if I call it on, say, enum, it scrolls past the bottom of my screen. Now my terminal has the ability to scroll back, but if I scroll back and then I accidentally hit a key, I'm now snapped back down to the bottom. I've completely lost my place. So what I can do is that since this is just a command line, I can pass it into a reader, and I now have documentation that I can scroll up and down with, do whatever I want in a pager, search, highlight, etc. With any module that I have access to with xhelp. So the key features here are, so we have open. I've got a -t helper that displays types, got a -b helper that displays behavior. My main innovation and a lot of the work that went into this is I added a search function. So in IEX, I have tab completion. In the command line, I don't have tab completion. So I wanted the ability to search modules and functions. So if I do -s and put in the beginning of a module, it will find all the modules that begin with that kind of stub. And similarly, I can do xhelp like enum.m and find all of the enum functions that begin with the letter M. Now that's a bit limited because it's only a starts with behavior. So I added in a -- all modules flag, which I can then pass into grep and say, okay, which modules begin with li, which Erlang modules begin with li, for example. It's just lists, nothing exciting there. But I also have an all functions flag, which returns every module function pair with its arity. So I can grab that and say, okay, which functions are arity 11 or arity 111, I suppose. People who are better at grep and regex can see where grep is useful here. And I'm sorry to report that this debts v9 is not particularly exciting. It's just the implementation of debts, and it just warns you as such when you open up the source code. Actually, we can do that. Debts v9. We can just, and it works with Erlang modules as well. So I can open this up, and it's like debts files, implementation part, to be called from debts.erl only, i.e. don't use this. But similarly, if you have Erlang documentation compiled on your system, then it will work with Erlang documentation as well. So I can put in an Erlang module and get back the documentation to standard output the same way. But the killer feature, as it were, is that it has mix support. So if I put in -s mix, like you would expect from IEX, I can now run a search on the modules in this project that I've downloaded as dependencies. Now it's going to compile because I think I've changed my Elixir version since the last time. Just like IEX, when you run it with mix, it forces a compilation step to make sure that you actually have the Beam files with the documentation, etc. This is proof that I didn't prepare as well as I should have before the show and tell, but get to see how my 10-year-old computer churns on compiling dependencies for Ziegler. It's taking more than 10 seconds for the Elixir Lexer, apparently. But with -s mix, it will work, like the documentation will pull up from dependencies. So if you want to read your Ecto documentation that you've downloaded as part of Phoenix, you can just pull it up, put it into a pager and read through it. You can search through modules that exist in your project or your dependencies. So this, when it's finished, should relay a list of modules that begin with Zig, including all of the Ziegler modules, in theory. Still compiling, as it were. Oh, there we go. So Zig.assembler, code, command, etc. And even down here at the bottom, my project, Ziegler Explorer, exists and has modules that I can look at down here. So similarly, I can now pull up the documentation for Zig and pass it into a pager. It takes a bit longer with Mix because it has to do the Mix startup process. But now I have documentation that works with it. One thing that I added is that it has a .IEX EXS support. So if you have your own customizations to IEX in a .IEX EXS file, you can either have one globally and then it's overridden per project, but you can change colors and defaults of what the output of the documentation looks like as it suits or strikes your fancy. I think the default colors are fine, and I don't know any of them off the top of my head, so I won't try to flub a demo adding a color dynamically for this show and tell. But this is Xhelp. It's available now on GitHub. I'll put the link in the chat in a moment, and I've been fairly thorough in the documentation on GitHub. So if you have any questions or concerns, or you find any sharp edges, please let me know. I want to sand those down.
Wow, that looks pretty handy. I'm going to play with it myself, just saying. Any other questions or comments for Rowland? Any other show and tell?
I have a dumb Postgres trick if anyone wants it.
I love it. Let's see it.
Always.
Was that Chris? With the always. Anyway, here. Yes, it is Chris. I believe I'm sharing. Yes, possibly.
Yep,
Yes.
we see it.
All right, cool. So over here, I'm very proud of this, by the way. This is valid XML, if you're wondering. But here's the fun facts. So there's not a lot of code to this. It's going to be a full-on library. I've been fighting a little bit of illness, so I've been bad about documentation, so I haven't put on hex yet, but I did write the tests. So a very short version is, did we all know that XML is a native data type inside Postgres? No, because we keep avoiding that. So it is a native data type. So I've extended Postgres and technically Ecto as well with a mild amount of instruction set to support persisting XML. Now, that's fine, and it just buys you these first two tests. At least that's what I thought it was doing, where it validates the XML as it's going in. So like this test here is if I pass it unbalanced XML, it will come back and be like, hey, you passed an unbalanced XML, which is not a big deal. However, when you dig a little further deeper into the XML docs inside Postgres, there's something called XML table, which is a select query. And you can actually query XML files directly as if they're tables. So like if you look here, I have a very large and cranky, it's not very large, it's reasonable with size, but about a couple thousand line XML podcast here. So I load this up in the test suite, save it, just put it directly in, and this is the return value as if a normal XML thing. I actually put it in here, but when I do select XML table, all of it from XFL test, which is where I'm putting it, you have to preface the namespaces. This is actually quite important because otherwise it gets very cranky. Then you say where it is inside the architecture. These work like directories, so you can CD up one if you want to, if this is your main querying thing. And then you just do column, you define what the columns of the XML based table is and do them, and they just come out as if they're normal Postgres, which includes the same thing. If you had this in some sort of materialized view or something, you could query it directly with Ecto. So this is complete, like you don't, the implementation details are actually quite simple, like basically just extending Postgres here. But I'm going to have this on the hex thing relatively soon. I just need to sit down and write docs. So that's it. And Chris is doing all the things. Why? Because Chris helped me with the original XML stuff, and then I showed him XML table, and he's like, "What drugs are you on over there?" It's like, "Well, it's Vancouver, many." So, anyways, that's just that. And also to prove I was paying attention in this talk, just another thing, which is an old thing. I'm trying to rip out Hackney out of TZ data, but I was paying attention to your public key thing and started fixing things. So there you go. This is just TZ data brings in Hackney. I'm tired of debugging Hackney. So I constantly try to remove it. That's it.
Interesting. So what are you using instead?
Oh, just HTTPC. Which you did mention in your talk, but the Erlang user conference or whatever they call it nowadays, Codebeam, is it Codebeam now? Anyways, the thing in Sweden, Erlang 26, they're going to upgrade HTTPC at least to HTTP 2.
Nice.
Ooh.
Yeah, then there might be some room there, right?
Well, that's what I mean. At that point, because HTTPC is always a C library, so it's going to be a little less clunky, other than the current one is very clunky because no one touches it. But I could easily see us using HTTP 2 with some sort of pooling strategy, like oh boy, or take the one out of Finch as another adapter.
All right. Well, once OTP 26 comes out, I'd like to hear what you think about it. So
I'll be
report
cranky.
back.
Report
back.
I've never been happy with a software release in my life.
Good. At least you're consistent. That's good. So random question. So with this XML query thing, could you query like an Excel spreadsheet?
As long as it's articulated as XML, yes.
I mean, because that's the format, right? On the covers, it's all XML. It's nasty.
Oh
yeah. I wouldn't want to look at that code, but
no,
do it.
No. Okay. I'm just throwing it out there. It's a good abuse of technology.
Literally any XML, and actually the thing I left out, it's like hyper fast, because what I was working on was parsing XML via Saxi, which is relatively thing, but like parsing 1 megabyte of XML is fractions of a second. It's just because it cheats a little bit. When you persist XML, it tokenizes everything. So you get to use that speed advantage when you start querying it.
It's already parsed. Got
Yeah.
it. Cool. All right.
Hmm.
Other show and tell? Going once? Going twice? All right. I'm going to turn the lady off. Stop the recording. If I can find